During Sunday Mass, a man challenged God in front of everyone. What happened immediately after left? Everyone frozen and proved that God exists. Robert's apartment was on the third floor of an old building whose hallways smelled of dampness and cheap disinfectant. It was a cramped space, with a single window overlooking an interior courtyard full of hanging laundry. The sun barely made it through for a few hours each day, casting shadows that seemed to stretch across the stained walls. Inside, chaos reigned, half-open boxes, old newspapers, and empty beer bottles scattered on the floor. A faded couch and an old TV rounded out the scene of neglect. However, the most striking aspect was the collection of old photographs displayed in dusty frames. They showed smiling faces, a younger Robert hugging a kind-looking woman, a small child gazing at him with admiration, and several family snapshots that hinted at happier times. Robert was 40 years old, though the lines on his forehead and the weariness in his eyes made him look older. He had been unemployed for several months, getting by on odd jobs or the dwindling loans offered by old friends. His divorce had taken place a couple of years prior, and since then he had battled a deepening depression. He had also turned to drinking, finding in alcohol a fleeting escape from his failures and guilt. Mornings passed in an almost sepulchral silence as he moved like a purposeless ghost among the remnants of his own domestic chaos. One afternoon, while a faint ray of light threaded through the window and drew a golden line on the cracked floor, Robert found himself staring at one of the photographs. It showed him standing next to his ex-wife on their wedding day, with a broad smile and a face lit with hope. He recalled those days when he had shared dreams, family plans, and the firm desire to be a good father. Yet life had taken him along roads he never imagined. Unemployment, constant arguments, and his own insecurities opened up a gap impossible to close. His wife decided to leave, taking their child with her. In the silence of the apartment, Robert let out a sigh loaded with bitterness. He approached the small kitchen table, crammed with dirty dishes, and grabbed a half-empty bottle of beer. He needed to swallow some liquid oblivion to chase away the lump in his throat. He drank several gulps, eyes still fixed on that photograph, until words began to form in his mind like a quiet soliloquy. How did I get here? When did I become someone incapable of taking care of his own? He asked himself as the alcohol burned his throat. He regretted every mistake and felt the weight of not being able to keep his family together. Amid his musings, he realized he hadn't left the house for days, except for occasional trips downstairs to buy cigarettes or grab something to eat with the little money left. His social circle had practically vanished. Former co-workers no longer called, and he had grown distant from his relatives. Even so, something inside him cried out for a chance, a drastic change to pull him out of his desolation. On his better days, he fantasized about finding a job and winning back the child he barely saw, but that hope disappeared as fast as a cigarette burning between his lips. Meanwhile, the city carried on, indifferent to Robert's personal tragedy. Far from his apartment, other lives were unfolding, though he had no way of knowing they would intersect with his own. Anna, who owned a small grocery store, was arranging products on the shelves. She was a kind and steadfast woman, always ready to help someone in need, though she faced constant struggles to keep her business afloat. Across town, in a corporate building, Charles was reviewing paperwork and making phone calls. He ran a medium-sized company and prided himself on giving second chances to people in need, perhaps because he, too, had once been on the brink of bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Lucy, a single mother of 2 small children, was juggling her time between cleaning someone else's house and helping her kids with their homework. She worried about her unstable employment and the unpaid bills piling up, yet she preserved a resilient, hopeful spirit. Near the main church, Father Michael stepped out of the sacristy with a pensive look. He was preparing for Sunday Mass and, despite his faith, was dealing with an internal crisis he kept hidden from his parishioners. In a nearby park, Diego, a rebellious young man running with a questionable group, plotted his next mischief in search of easy money. His lost gaze and defiant manner showed he trusted no one, not even himself. Isabel, for her part, was at home gathering materials for her weekly support group meeting. She was a compassionate woman who had gone through a difficult bereavement and found a way to cope through helping others. She offered a place for those who felt alone or adrift, encouraging them to speak freely and find solace. So, each of these characters went about their lives in parallel, with no apparent overlap. But on an ordinary day, destiny would begin weaving unseen threads that would pull them all to a single place, a single moment that would change everything. No one would have imagined that Robert, holed up in his apartment and drowning in alcohol, would spark a chain of events that would test their deepest beliefs. When the sunset began painting the sky orange, Robert glanced at the dusty clock hanging on the wall. He remembered it was Saturday, and for some unfathomable reason, he felt urged to think about the next day's Mass. It had been years since he'd set foot in a church, his faith withering away like his youthful hopes. Yet that night, he felt the need to go there, maybe searching for a last spiritual lifeline or simply a change of scene. He wondered whether there could be something beyond his despair. Weariness and the beer's effects pushed him to lie down early, though his sleep was uneasy. He dreamed of his son, imagining him running through a park filled with laughter. He saw the tender smile of his ex-wife, looking at him lovingly, as if time had not passed and the reproaches had faded. But upon waking, the same emptiness, the same disorder, and the same half-empty bottle on the table greeted him. Sunday morning arrived without heralding any major changes. Robert woke with a headache and rummaged through his wallet for money to buy coffee. He found a few loose coins and headed to the corner store, where Anna was attending the first customers of the day. They knew each other only from passing encounters, yet she always offered him a kind smile whenever he showed up with his tired expression. That morning, Anna greeted him warmly, noting his dark circles and the rough look brought on by his hangover. On his way home, coffee in hand, Robert passed by the church. He watched the people arriving, entire families, couples chatting happily. Children ran across the courtyard, laughing gleefully, while Father Michael welcomed everyone with a forced smile that tried to mask his own doubts. Robert felt a faint stir in his stomach, part nerves and part curiosity. He decided that after he dropped the coffee at home and cleaned himself up a bit, he would come back to attend Mass. In the final minutes before the service, the church filled with murmurs. Isabel set out leaflets for her support group on a table near the entrance, offering an encouraging glance to each person who came close. Charles made an appearance as well, greeting acquaintances and promising that he'd soon be hiring again. Exhausted, Lucy took a seat in a back pew, worried about how she'd make rent that month. And Diego, who rarely attended Mass, lingered around the entrance, as though compelled by a feeling he couldn't explain. Meanwhile, Robert arrived with unsteady steps, feeling out of place. He saw so many happy families that envy and nostalgia hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood still for a few seconds, unsure whether to turn back or keep going into the temple. In the end, he moved forward and entered, seating himself in a corner where he hoped no one would notice him. No one could have predicted what would happen that Sunday, or the deeper reasons that led Robert to stand in a sacred place after so long. Even so, everyone present, from Anna to Lucy, from Charles to Father Michael, would play a part in a chain of events that would test their convictions and hopes. That church, a silent witness to countless joys and sorrows, was about to face a challenge that would shake its congregation's hearts and offer, perhaps, an unexpected sign of God's presence. Thus ended a Sunday morning that had promised to be as routine as any other, but would ultimately mark a turning point for them all. Robert, mired in sorrow and weighed down by guilt, had come before an altar that meant nothing to him anymore, or so he believed. Unknowingly, he was about to spark a wave of change, not only in his own life, but in the entire community, which would soon witness the impossible become reality. 5. That Sunday morning, the church was packed. The soft murmur of the faithful filled the air, and the warm scent of incense mingled with the flowers adorning the altar. Men, women, and children filled the pews, some in their usual spots, others seeking a more discreet corner. Father Michael, dressed in his ceremonial vestments, walked silently toward the pulpit, his gaze fixed on the congregation. The sermon he had prepared dealt with hope and the importance of community, a topic he found particularly meaningful given his current state of mind. Despite his internal doubts, he strove to deliver a message of encouragement to the families who trusted him each Sunday to find spiritual comfort. Robert was among the congregation, sitting to the side, almost hidden behind the main column. His posture was stiff. He was trying to keep his eyes on Father Michael as he spoke. Inwardly, though, he felt disconnected, as if the sermon were nothing but a distant echo bouncing off the church walls. He had come by sheer inertia, propelled by a spark of curiosity and need. Yet his heart remained closed, locked in resentment and fatigue. Father Michael's words rang with a firm yet compassionate tone. He spoke of how solidarity could restore lost faith and how the unity of the community offered refuge to those who felt lonely. Without singling anyone out, he mentioned there was always someone willing to listen and extend a hand. The sermon, meant to stir reflection in those present, gave way to a more solemn mood. Some nodded, deeply moved. Others sat in silence, praying in their hearts. Suddenly, as the Mass reached its most emotional point, Robert felt a powerful jolt in his chest, as though something inside him had been struck. Images of his ruined apartment, empty bottles, his absent child, and his ex-wife's reproaches raced through his mind. A deep, contained anger started to boil inside him, growing with every comforting word Father Michael spoke. He found himself unable to hold it in, and before he knew it, he stood up abruptly. "Enough!" he burst out, shattering the reverent silence. All eyes turned to him. Father Michael stopped his sermon at once, surprised by the interruption. A couple of mothers instinctively covered their younger children's ears, while others turned to see who had broken the silence. Even so, Robert didn't back down. His breathing quickened, and his tense face revealed years, perhaps decades, of pent-up despair. "You speak of hope, of community, of a faith that can do anything," he continued with a trembling voice. "Where is this merciful God when you really need him? Where was he when my family fell apart? When I lost my job and had to drink just to endure my failures?" A palpable tension spread throughout the church. Even Diego, who had lingered near the entrance without wanting to participate, opened his eyes wide in surprise. From her pew, Anna felt a pang in her chest at the sight of Robert's distraught face, and Charles, who was also present, furrowed his brow, unsure how to respond. Lucy, crouched in one of the back seats, covered her mouth with her hand, afraid a bigger confrontation might follow. Father Michael, focused on Robert, recognized his pain without needing further explanation. He stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture of peace, yet Robert kept speaking, not losing an ounce of intensity. "If God exists, why doesn't he do anything for me?" he cried, a hint of plea in his voice. "I've prayed, I've asked, I've begged for help, and my life is still hell." The silence that followed was so dense, it felt like the very air had turned into an impenetrable wall. A few more conservative parishioners shot him reproachful looks, but most watched him with a blend of compassion and astonishment. Father Michael swallowed hard. He felt everyone's eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. "Son," he finally whispered, "I see your suffering. I can see it in your face. No one knows your story better than you. But I ask you to at least try to list." Before he could finish the sentence, Robert let out a frustrated snort and lurched out of his pew, brushing past an elderly man who had stood up to calm him. His despair outweighed any shame he might have felt. He no longer cared about being the center of attention. In just a few seconds, the man who had tried so hard to go unnoticed became the protagonist of that Sunday Mass. The congregation was stunned. Some covered their faces with their hands, others remained as still as statues, and still others began silently praying for him. Anna felt an urge to follow him, but hesitated, unsure if she should. Charles exchanged glances with a neighbor, wondering if he should intervene. Lucy, burdened by her own sorrows, shuddered at the sight of someone else's anguish. Father Michael closed his eyes for a moment to steady himself. Raising his voice calmly, he asked the faithful to join in a brief prayer for Robert and for all those who suffered in silence. Though he projected an air of serenity, inwardly he felt a great weight upon realizing how fragile hope can be in the hearts of those who have lost everything. The service continued, but the atmosphere was irreversibly changed. Robert had shaken the foundations of that Sunday Mass, leaving the community divided between compassion and bewilderment. With that impulsive act, he had challenged not only the faith of those present, but unwittingly also sparked a flame that would unite all those souls in a common goal. To find out if the Godfather Michael preached about really heard their pleas, and if so, why he had allowed so much pain to take hold of so many lives. No one knew it yet, but that defiant plea would forever alter the lives of those who witnessed the desperate cry of a man consumed by despair that morning. 5. When Mass ended, people slowly filed out of the church. The air still carried the tension from the moment Robert had raised his voice against God, and many parishioners left in silence, moved or surprised by his outburst of desperation. While most avoided even looking at him, Anna stayed in the sanctuary a few minutes longer, watching Robert pace nervously near the door, as though he didn't know where else to go. Guided by her caring nature, she felt compelled to approach him. Anna, owner of the little grocery store in the neighborhood, was not easily intimidated. She had a generous heart and was always ready to help anyone in need. That morning, seeing the anguish etched into Robert's face, she understood that here was a man carrying a heavy burden in his soul. Without hesitating, she walked toward him with a determined step and a gentle smile. "Hey, are you all right?" she asked, carefully placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. He flinched at her touch and moved away a little, as if afraid that someone's concern would hurt him even more than he already was. "I'm fine," he replied hoarsely, staring at the floor. "I don't need anyone's help." Anna noticed his resistance but didn't back down. She offered him a tissue so he could wipe the cold sweat from his brow. At first, Robert seemed unsure whether to accept it, but finally he took it with a weary sigh, secretly grateful for the gesture, even if he couldn't admit it out loud. "I heard what you said in there," Anna went on, free of judgment or reproach. "I don't know what you're going through, but if at any point you need to talk or just need a break, my store is on the corner of Main Street. There'll always be a hot cup of coffee waiting for you." Robert lifted his eyes and found Anna's understanding gaze. A surge of shame over his outburst in the church washed over him, followed by a pang of pride that prompted him to reject her offer. He merely muttered a curt, "Thank you," before hurrying away from the church, trying to leave behind the stir he himself had caused. Yet the moment he stepped onto the church's front steps, he came face to face with Charles. Dressed in a smart suit, Charles recognized him immediately. They had crossed paths years before at local events, and although they weren't close, Charles knew enough about Robert to see how much he had deteriorated. "Robert, right?" Charles said, friendly, but with a note of seriousness. "It's been a while since I've seen you around. I heard you've been having a tough time." Robert felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't in the mood to explain himself to anyone, least of all a man who, in his eyes, represented the success and stability he had lost. Even so, he forced himself to respond with a grunt that was meant to sound like a greeting. "I heard a little of what happened inside," Charles continued tactfully. "Look, I don't want to pry where I'm not wanted, but I know you've been looking for work. I'm restructuring my company, and maybe I could give you a shot." The offer took Robert by surprise. His eyebrows rose in disbelief. Part of him was tempted to accept on the spot, but another part, resentful and proud, drove him to be defensive. It was too humiliating, he thought, to accept charity from someone he barely knew. So, in a brusque tone, he replied, "I don't need your charity. I know you're trying to help, but this just isn't the right time." Charles didn't push. He sensed the rigidity in Robert's words and realized that he would need time to come to terms with the offer. With a slight nod, he took a business card from his wallet and handed it over calmly. "It's not charity, trust me. But if you change your mind, call me." Robert slipped the card into his back pocket with a shrug and left the church, feeling overwhelmed. Almost without noticing, he found himself on Main Street, where Anna's store was located. He had no intention of going in, but his thirst and fatigue led him to buy something to soothe his nerves. Reluctantly, he pushed open the glass door and looked around the shop. Clean, cozy, filled with the pleasant smell of freshly baked bread. Inside was Lucy, a single mother who looked exhausted, yet had a determined gaze, checking the prices on a few groceries. She held a handful of coins and seemed to be carefully calculating every expense. From behind the counter, Anna greeted her warmly and asked about her children. Lucy offered a shy smile, admitting that although she worked cleaning houses and doing laundry, it was getting harder and harder to make ends meet. "I'll do whatever it takes," Lucy was saying, "but sometimes I feel like there's no way out." Standing by the door, Robert heard those words and felt a pang of familiarity. He knew exactly how it felt to be trapped and hopeless. Though he tried to ignore it, something stirred inside him. He approached the counter, putting down a few coins to pay for a bottle of water. Anna served him with the same kindness as before, as though she hadn't noticed his earlier, awkward refusal. "I hope you're feeling better," she said quietly, sliding the bottle toward him. Robert didn't respond. He glanced briefly at Lucy, who seemed lost in her own worries, and waved a clumsy goodbye. As he left, a jumble of conflicting emotions tumbled through him. On one hand, pride and distrust still blocked any attempts at closeness. On the other, the compassion he felt for Lucy and Anna's generous attitude unsettled him. It was as if something were pushing him to change, to stop wallowing in resentment. That day, without meaning to, Robert took his first step toward forging connections with those who would later prove vital in his transformation. Anna, with her unwavering kindness, Charles, whose job offer still stood, and Lucy, locked in her struggle to get by and care for her children, all planted in him the first seeds of doubt about his own failure. Although Robert left without accepting any help, he couldn't prevent the doorway to a possible redemption from cracking open. 5. The hours following that tumultuous Sunday became a whirlwind of reflections for Robert. Charles's business card, tucked into the back pocket of his pants, felt as heavy as an anchor. His pride pushed him to refuse any form of help he hadn't earned on his own, but his growing desperation, along with the memories of his family, made him see the offer as a possible life raft. At last, on a rainy morning, Robert mustered the courage to call the number on the card. With a shaky voice, he set up a meeting with Charles to visit the company and see if he might fit into any position. The next day, he arrived at a mid-sized office building, its facade discreetly displaying the company's logo. Inside, the space was tidy and efficient, with wide hallways and bright offices. Charles greeted him in the reception area with a kind, if guarded, smile. He led Robert through the building, explaining that the company distributed household goods. As they toured the warehouse and delivery sections, Charles spoke candidly about his philosophy of offering opportunities to people who, for various reasons, had trouble returning to the workforce. Robert listened carefully, unsure how to respond. "I know you're going through a rough patch," Charles acknowledged, pausing next to a door labeled Human Resources. "If you decide to accept, we can start you on a temporary contract and see how it goes." Robert took a deep breath. Even so, a current of doubt coursed through his mind. Could he handle the pressure of working again? Would he have the discipline for schedules and responsibilities? But when he shook Charles's hand, he realized that his earlier refusal had begun to fade. He no longer saw this opportunity as humiliating, but rather as a genuine chance to escape the pit where he had languished for so long. "All right," he finally said. "I'll do my best not to let you down." Later that same day, needing to buy some groceries, Robert found himself once more at Anna's store. It still had the same cozy atmosphere, with the aroma of freshly baked bread and sunlight streaming through the large window. Anna greeted him as usual, not reproaching him for having avoided her since their last talk. As Robert browsed the shelves, he noticed Lucy again, her face marked by worry. She was telling Anna about a problem at her cleaning job. The manager of the house she worked in suspected her of stealing a few missing items and, lacking proof but acting on suspicion, threatened to fire her or even pursue legal action. Lucy denied any involvement, but her voice trembled as she explained her side of the story. At that moment, Robert felt an unexpected surge of empathy. Seeing Lucy on the verge of tears, afraid of losing her only source of income, stirred something inside him. Approaching her, he noticed that she looked at him timidly, probably remembering his outburst at the church. But Robert merely offered her a look of compassion. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone noticeably softer than usual. Lucy shrugged helplessly and explained the situation: the missing items, the unfair suspicions, the looming threat of dismissal. Robert, recalling the days when he desperately tried to find any job to support his family, felt an urge to help. He didn't know how, but something told him he couldn't just stand by. "Maybe we could talk to someone, clear things up," he suggested cautiously. "I know a couple of people who work in that neighborhood. Maybe they can vouch for your honesty." That offer, something he might once have ignored, rang out as a first step towards solidarity. Lucy, her eyes lit with hope, nodded slightly and accepted his help. They agreed to meet once she had more information about who was accusing her and why. Anna, who watched from behind the counter, smiled quietly, sensing the change taking place in Robert's heart. Upon leaving the store, Robert headed toward the neighborhood park, where he remembered seeing Diego on several occasions. Something told him that this rebellious young man, who hung around the church, could be on the verge of getting into bigger trouble if no one reached out to him. Sure enough, he found him there, sitting on a bench alongside a few other kids who wore skeptical expressions. When Robert approached, Diego's friends scattered, shooting wary glances in his direction. Diego, meanwhile, remained seated, arms crossed and chin lifted in a defiant stance. Even so, he didn't immediately reject Robert's presence, who clumsily sat down beside him. "Why are you looking for me?" Diego asked, not bothering to hide his distrust. "Because I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong anywhere," Robert answered with a shrug. "I just wanted to see how you're doing, and, I don't know, if you need anything." Diego narrowed his eyes, as though weighing whether this was some sort of joke. Silence stretched on for several seconds, broken only by the chirping of birds and the faint rustle of leaves blown by the wind. At last, the young man stood up without another word and began to walk away, though not before muttering a curt, "I'm fine, for now." Although the conversation was brief and inconclusive, Robert sensed a small crack in that otherwise closed-off response. He got the impression that, deep down, Diego wasn't used to people taking an interest in him without ulterior motives. It was a fleeting moment, yet one that could hold real potential. That day, between his visit to Charles's company, his promise to help Lucy, and his first attempt at talking with Diego, Robert realized that change didn't necessarily manifest itself in grand, heroic gestures, but rather in small, everyday acts of empathy and mutual support. And, without even noticing, he began to glimpse the possibility of a new beginning, one that just might help him leave behind the resentment that had consumed him for so long. 5. The following week carried a strange mix of tension and small hopes for Robert. He had accepted Charles's offer to work at the company, even though he still feared failing again. He had also committed to helping Lucy gather information to clear her name from the alleged thefts at the house where she worked. Still, none of these decisions fully lifted the weight from his shoulders. the nights remained filled with insomnia and loneliness. One morning, while sorting through a few papers on the tiny desk in his dilapidated apartment, he heard a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Father Michael, who removed his cap and greeted him with a kind but cautious smile. The priest had not seen Robert since that Sunday Mass, when he, overwhelmed by despair, challenged God in front of everyone. "May I come in for a moment?" Father Michael asked, his voice low. Robert stepped aside, surprised to see him there, and motioned for him to sit on the worn-out sofa. The priest discreetly surveyed the apartment. He noticed the still unopened boxes, the empty bottles in one corner, and the dusty photographs on the wall. He felt a slight pang in his stomach, imagining how much loneliness might be contained in that small space. Without beating around the bush, he explained that he had come to offer a private conversation, a chance for Robert to express whatever weighed on his heart, free from judgment or reproach. "Maybe you don't trust the church," the priest said softly, "but I'd like to listen to you and offer my support if you need it." Robert looked at Father Michael warily, recalling the last time he'd seen him at the altar, talking about faith and hope. For a few seconds, he considered sending him away, but the sincerity in the priest's eyes and his own need to unburden himself drove him to accept. And so they began a conversation in which Robert, at first sullen and terse, gradually opened the floodgates to his feelings. He talked about the guilt that haunted him for losing his family, the frustration of being unable to find steady work, and the despondency that consumed him from dawn till night. Father Michael listened attentively, nodding in silence, as if each of Robert's confessions was a long-held truth, finally seeing the light. Yet the priest carried his own burdens. For months, he'd been wrestling with growing doubts about his vocation and the challenge of guiding a congregation he saw beset by problems and scarcity. Each time he was called upon to counsel someone, he wondered if he truly possessed the inner strength to do so. While he strove to nourish the faith of his parishioners, there were moments when his own faith wavered. Once Robert had poured out his heart, he fell silent, as though he found it hard to believe someone could listen without judging him. Father Michael then ventured to share, in cautious words, some of his own inner struggle. "Sometimes, even those of us who wear the cloth feel as though God is far away. We think we've run out of answers, and we're afraid we won't be able to hold others up." Robert blinked, surprised by the priest's vulnerability. Rather than making him suspicious, this confession drew him closer. He realized that appearances could be deceiving, and that a priest's vestments didn't make Father Michael immune to earthly troubles. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by the ring of Father Michael's cell phone. With an apologetic look, he checked the incoming message and frowned. It was from Isabel, a woman in the community who led a support group for people dealing with grief and difficult situations. She needed to speak with him urgently, feeling that her group was not only growing in size, but also in the complexity of the challenges its members faced. Many needed spiritual guidance, and the usual sessions of listening and emotional therapy weren't enough anymore. Father Michael seized the opportunity to tell Robert that Isabel had invited him to her group more than once, but until then, he hadn't mustered the courage to attend. She had her own difficult story. Years ago, she lost her partner and channeled her pain into helping others. Yet beneath her apparent strength, she too struggled with fears and scars she wouldn't always admit. "Maybe you should stop by one day," the priest suggested, eyeing Robert with a mixture of hope and caution. "You'd meet other people who, like you, have hit rock bottom and are looking for something to hold on to." Robert shrugged, declining to make any promises. Even so, something stirred within him at the thought of a place where he could talk without feeling judged. Sensing his hesitation, Father Michael proposed that in the meantime they continue meeting occasionally. Robert nodded and agreed to meet again, if only to carry on this conversation which, without his wanting to admit it, was beginning to give him a glimmer of solace. When the priest left, Robert shut the door quietly. They had agreed to meet the following week, this time at the parish, with more time and privacy. While a new spiritual connection certainly wouldn't solve his problems overnight, it did at least ease the crushing sense of isolation that had consumed him in recent years. Meanwhile, Father Michael returned to the church where Isabel was waiting. They exchanged their worries. He, unsure of his ability to lead a community so burdened by grief. She, fearful of being unable to meet the emotional needs of those who attended her support group. With a sigh, they clung to the idea that, in spite of their own inner darkness, they could keep serving as a beacon to those who felt lost. In that unspoken understanding, they forged a pledge of mutual support that would, sooner or later, resonate in the hearts of everyone struggling to find light in the darkness. 5. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Anna opened her little store, ready for a new workday. At such an early hour, the streets lay still and empty, and a cool morning breeze grazed the walls of the houses. Despite the economic struggles and worries that kept her awake at night, Anna often found purpose in her daily tasks, a reason to stand firm. Yet on this particular morning, her thoughts were focused on someone else: Diego. The teenage boy who so often hung around the store, usually in a defiant mood, now occupied her concern and curiosity. A couple of days earlier, Anna had come upon him sitting on the curb, staring blankly ahead, a half-lit cigarette in his hand. She felt an urge to approach him and ask how he was. Far from appreciative, Diego had glared at her suspiciously and responded curtly. But Anna refused to be intimidated. She glimpsed in his eyes a mix of sadness and confusion that she simply couldn't ignore. Speaking calmly, she let him know that if he ever felt like talking or needed a place to pass the time, she was there for him. That morning, while stocking shelves with cans and bags of flour, Anna remembered that brief exchange and decided to take another step. Spotting Diego passing by on the sidewalk, she didn't hesitate to call out and offer him a small paid errand, helping her organize merchandise and tidy up the storage room. It was a simple task, but it might be the first step in building a more genuine connection. Diego responded with a disbelieving grunt and a shrug that barely concealed his skepticism. Still, the promise of a little cash in his pocket was enough to persuade him to accept grudgingly. His initial resistance was obvious during the first hours of work. Diego lifted boxes half-heartedly and hardly spoke. Anna kept her composure, aware that behind his tough exterior lay a boy in need of guidance. As time passed, she took the opportunity to ask him casual questions: what kind of music he liked, whether he often attended school, or if he had any hobbies. Though he spoke little, Diego began to drop small hints about his life that, unintentionally, revealed how much he lacked emotional support and how dubious some of his friendships were. Anna, ever patient, listened without judging. She had decided the best way to help Diego was to earn his trust little by little. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Lucy faced an unforeseen dilemma. She had been working for several weeks as a secretary and assistant at Charles's company on a month-to-month basis. Her main motivation was providing for her children. This paycheck allowed her to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. But while she was filing documents and reviewing invoices, she noticed irregularities in the records. Initially, she thought they might be simple administrative errors. Yet as she dug deeper, she uncovered what looked like a pattern of inflated expenses and non-existent payments. Uneasy, above all, worried about the consequences of what she'd uncovered, Lucy wondered whether the corruption stemmed from Charles himself or someone else in the company. Charles had always come across as decent and generous toward his employees, but the numbers didn't lie. Her internal conflict was plain to see. If she decided to blow the whistle, she risked losing both her job and her children's livelihood. On the other hand, her conscience told her she couldn't ignore something that clearly harmed the company and those who depended on it. Days went by, and each time Lucy tried to approach Charles about it, something held her back. After all, he had shown integrity on many occasions, and she preferred to have solid evidence before voicing any suspicions. With a furrowed brow and shoulders tense, Lucy stared at the documents on her desk, wondering what the right course of action would be. Elsewhere, Robert was having an unexpected moment in his apartment. Having started his new job at Charles's company, unaware of the predicament Lucy was facing, he decided to clean up his home, aiming to rid himself of the chaos and mess that had reigned for months. A new job meant, he thought, a new beginning, and perhaps a more suitable setting for when his son might come to visit. As he swept away the accumulated dust from the corners and went through old boxes, he came across a yellowed envelope bearing a date from years before. The unmistakable handwriting of his ex-wife brought him back to better times when they still walked hand in hand and dreamed of a shared future. With trembling fingers, Robert opened the envelope and found a letter he had never read. Inside, his ex-wife described how exhausting their relationship had become during those last months living together. The constant arguments, her loneliness in the face of his drinking, and her desperation at not knowing how to help him. Yet, despite all the pain, the letter conveyed a deep love and a genuine desire for reconciliation. She wrote that if, at some point, he decided to seek help and change, she would be willing to forgive and recognize his effort. She also mentioned their son, the dreams they had once shared, and the hope that, one day, they might rebuild their broken bonds. Reading those lines shook Robert to the core. On the one hand, he felt a sharp pang of guilt recalling how he had thrown away the trust and affection they once had. On the other, he felt a strange warmth at the realization that, despite the time and mistakes, there was still a slightly open door to forgiveness. The letter, forgotten for years in some corner, now emerged as a symbol that all was not lost. With his breath quickening and his heart pounding, he realized he needed that ray of hope to keep him on the path he was beginning to travel. Charles's job offer, the help he was giving Lucy, and his spiritual connection with Father Michael all took on a new meaning. If he truly wanted to regain his family's love, he would have to persevere in his pursuit of redemption and, above all, keep faith in himself. Thus, each character moved forward at their own crossroads. Anna persisted in offering Diego a helping hand, Lucy grappled internally over the corruption she had discovered, and Robert, both excited and fearful, felt that reading that letter marked the start of a new chapter. There was still a long road ahead, but the foundations of their transformations were beginning to solidify, propelled by empathy, truth, and forgiveness. 5. The afternoon Lucy finally dared to confide in Robert about her suspicions of corruption at Charles's company, they were both at Anna's store, sitting beside the small wooden counter. Outside, the sun was casting its last rays and stretching shadows across the sidewalk. From the back of the store, Anna watched them with concern, noticing the tension in Lucy's face and the reflective look in Robert's eyes. Lucy had stumbled upon dubious records in the company invoices almost by accident. The recorded amounts didn't match the distributed products, and the inflated numbers suggested that someone was tampering with the accounting to divert funds. Initially, she feared Charles might be responsible, but the more she investigated, the more convinced she became that the source of the problem lay elsewhere in the company. She felt trapped between reporting her findings and risking her job, her main source of income for her children, or remaining silent and becoming complicit. Meanwhile, Robert had spent days considering how to prove that, despite his past mistakes, he was still capable of acting with integrity. He recalled the letter from his ex-wife, which had rekindled a desire for redemption deep within. Now, seeing the pallor on Lucy's face, he understood that he couldn't just stand by while she faced this moral dilemma alone. "What will you do?" he asked softly, his voice tight with concern. "I don't know," Lucy admitted, lowering her gaze. "If I report the corruption, I could lose my job, and if I don't, I'll be an accomplice." Robert took a breath, deciding to share what he had been mulling over. He assured her that he was willing to support her in investigating and exposing the truth, even if it meant facing potential consequences. After all, both he and Lucy owed something to Charles. She owed him for the job that was supporting her family. He owed him for the temporary contract that could become permanent. yet conscience weighed more heavily than gratitude. "If Charles is responsible, we'll have to accept it," Robert conceded. "And if he's not, he needs to know who's hurting his company." Lucy let out a faint sigh of relief at Robert's resolve. Together, they decided to gather as much information as possible, and when the time was right, present it to the proper authorities, or, at the very least, to Charles himself. Though Anna had no direct role in the investigation, she offered the use of her store as a safe place where they could meet discreetly to exchange information. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Isabel was struggling with a conflict that threatened the harmony of her support group. Ever since she founded it, the group had served as a refuge for those coping with grief or dire hardships. Isabel would listen, offer a shoulder to cry on, and provide practical guidance whenever she could. However, a new member named Marta had confessed to being involved in illegal activities in order to support her family. Isabel's dilemma was urgent. Her mission was to provide help and understanding, yet could she ignore Marta's unlawful acts? She feared that confronting her directly might drive her away, causing Marta to lose the only emotional support she had. But ignoring the problem risked compromising the safety and credibility of the entire group. In recent sessions, Isabel noted the growing unease among other members who sensed that something serious was going on with Marta. Exhausted and in need of an outside perspective, Isabel sought advice from Father Michael. After his initial conversation with Robert, the priest had begun to regain some faith in his ministry, though he still wrestled with his own doubts. Even so, when Isabel told him about Marta's case, he mustered words of encouragement that would allow her to make a decision that was both firm and compassionate. "We can't force anyone to turn themselves in," Father Michael said gently, "but we can show them the consequences of the path they've chosen. Above all, we have to make it clear that our goal is to help people heal, not to cover up actions that could endanger others." Isabel nodded, grateful for his support. For a while she had also sensed the priest's own fragility, but that day he seemed closer and more confident than ever. With his help and that of some community members, she devised a plan to speak with Marta in private. Isabel hoped that by empathizing with the dangers of Marta's situation, the woman would choose to change her course or at least seek professional assistance. That very night, while Isabel met with Marta in a room adjacent to the church, Father Michael waited in the sacristy, praying silently. He had spent weeks trying to restore his bond with his faith, and the task of guiding both Robert and Isabel had rekindled a glimmer of hope within him. He felt that in the act of service, he found renewed purpose in his vocation, even if he didn't have all the answers. After a conversation filled with tears and confessions, Marta didn't promise to turn herself in, but she acknowledged needing a change. With Isabel's help, she agreed to begin an emotional rehabilitation process and seek legal advice to end her illicit activities. It would be a complex path fraught with risks, but Isabel and Father Michael pledged to accompany her so that she wouldn't face it all alone. Gradually then, the individuals who had come together in that Sunday Mass were making choices that affected not only their own lives, but those of everyone around them. Robert and Lucy prepared to expose the corruption, risking the loss of Charles's trust, or even their own jobs. Meanwhile, Isabel brought a partial resolution to the tension in her support group by addressing Marta's situation, feeling backed by a Father Michael who now seemed stronger and more committed to his vocation. That evening, after saying goodbye to Lucy, Robert returned to his apartment with the sense that his life was turning a corner. The letter from his ex-wife still echoed in his mind, reminding him that redemption wasn't achieved overnight, but shaped by daily actions. Though he was unsure what they would discover about Charles's company, he clung to his resolve to do the right thing, picturing a day when his son might be proud of him. In this way, through moral dilemmas, moments of courage, and the rekindling of faith, each person moved one step closer to facing the consequences of their decisions. Bound by empathy and solidarity, their stories wove together into a complex tapestry that pointed slowly toward the promise of forgiveness and transformation. 5. News of the corruption uncovered at Charles's company spread quickly among employees and a few minor partners. From the moment Robert and Lucy found the courage to reveal the evidence, documents showing inflated amounts and non-existent payments, the atmosphere in the office changed dramatically. At first, bewilderment reigned. Some reacted with genuine surprise, others were skeptical or afraid of losing their jobs. No one, however, anticipated Charles's reaction. Far from denying the problem or blaming his workers, Charles confronted the situation with composure. He called an extraordinary meeting in which, under the employees' watchful eyes, he explained what had been uncovered and announced measures to reform the company. His clear and transparent stance stirred mixed reactions. Some applauded his bravery, while others, feeling betrayed, questioned him. Nevertheless, Charles stood firm. "We can't keep going as though nothing happened," he said, brow furrowed, standing before his team. "If any of you know more or have witnessed irregularities, now is the time to speak up. I'm not going to cover up anything." In the weeks that followed, Charles launched an internal audit and cooperated with the proper authorities to clarify the scope of the corruption. While the process temporarily harmed the company's reputation and lowered sales, he remained committed to putting it on a more honest path. Lucy, grateful not to have abetted a cover-up, assisted him in reorganizing, reviewing paperwork, and working with legal entities. Robert, meanwhile, continued in the temporary position Charles had offered him. Though he feared losing this opportunity, the businessman valued his courage in bringing the truth to light. Meanwhile, another event in the neighborhood signaled a major turning point for Diego. For weeks, he had been working off and on at Anna's store. Although he had initially shown reluctance and a bad attitude, Anna's patience and kindness gradually coaxed him into letting his guard down. One afternoon, however, Diego failed to show up at the agreed-upon time. Worried, Anna went out in search of him on the nearby streets. She found him at a critical moment. Diego had rejoined his old circle of friends, who were pressuring him to take part in an act of vandalism. Seeing the tension in the scene, Anna stepped in without hesitation. She put herself between Diego and the others, speaking firmly but softly, aware that one wrong move might provoke violence. At first, the group hurled insults and threats at her, but she stood her ground, shielding Diego as best she could. The situation turned dangerous when one of the boys, caught up in the adrenaline, shoved Anna hard. Despite Diego's outward indifference toward the world, he reacted instantly. He pushed his friend away from Anna and warned him not to touch her again. The others, taken aback by Diego's uncharacteristic reaction, left with jeers and menacing words. Anna, shaken from the fall, leaned against a wall to catch her breath. That moment was a breaking point. Shocked, Diego realized he had put at risk the one person who, in recent times, had shown any genuine interest in his welfare. After helping her up, he offered to walk her back to the store so she could tend to the scrapes she got from the shove. There, in the small stockroom where they usually worked together, Diego broke down in tears, ashamed of his behavior and fearful of what lay ahead. "I don't want to go on like this," he muttered, voice choked with sobs. "I'm tired of getting into trouble, tired of nobody caring about me." Anna, hand still trembling from the scare, assured him that he mattered to her and that she believed in his ability to set his life straight. She emphasized that if he needed professional help or support from the community, she was there for him, as were the people from the church. Diego nodded, tears still wet on his cheeks, finally willing to take a step away from the bad influences in his life. At the same time, Robert was also experiencing a profound internal shift. Each day he came home from work, he found in his ex-wife's letter a beacon reminding him why he had chosen to fight. Reading those lines, written with equal parts love and disappointment, spurred him to consider reconciling with his family. He started saving part of his salary so he could someday seek out his ex-wife and speak to her without being shackled by resentment and failure. That motivation helped him get through nights when he felt tempted to drown his anguish in alcohol. Instead of drinking, He challenged himself to draft a reply to her letter, even though he wasn't sure he would ever send it. In it, he expressed the pain he felt over their breakup, his shame at leaving her to deal with his addiction alone, and the hope that they might at least reconcile amicably for the sake of their son. Robert's changes did not go unnoticed by the community. Anna and Lucy noticed that he no longer showed up with dark circles under his eyes and a slurred voice. Even Charles, busy with reforming his business, remarked on Robert's diligence and dedication. Father Michael, who held regular talks with him, sensed how faith, or at least trust in a brighter future, was starting to blossom in Robert's heart. Though uncertain whether his ex-wife would be willing to hear him out, Robert was certain he needed to try. It was the only way to find genuine redemption. Thus, the entire neighborhood gradually felt the ripple effect of these transformations. Charles, determined to restore both his company's operations and the trust of his employees and customers, was undergoing a personal renewal as intense as the company's. Diego, rescued from a violent environment, found in Anna a role model who urged him to believe in his own potential. And Robert, driven by recollection and hope, ventured to rebuild the bridges he himself had burned. In this way, each choice they made began to bear fruit. Though the path remained difficult, the consequences of revealing the truth, facing danger, and rediscovering that forgotten letter opened the door to rebirth for everyone involved. With their eyes on an uncertain future, each pressed on with greater resolve, proving to themselves that change is possible when one finds the courage to face the consequences and embrace hope. The last few weeks had brought a wave of hope for Robert. His new job at Charles's company seemed to be taking root, and the memory of his ex-wife's letter motivated him to keep fighting the temptation to slip back into alcohol. However, in the midst of this apparent rebirth, a phone call arrived to shatter the fragile stability he had worked so hard to achieve. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to his ex-wife. She sounded worried and exhausted, as though she hadn't slept all night. She explained that their son, who had been hospitalized in the past due to health complications, had just suffered a serious relapse and was admitted once again. In a matter of minutes, Robert felt as if the ground were opening beneath his feet. Without a second thought, he grabbed his jacket and ran to the hospital. The journey felt endless as his mind raced with memories and fears. He couldn't help but reproach himself for all the time he had wasted in alcoholism and the distance he had kept from his family. Upon arrival, he was met by his ex-wife's drawn face and his son's frail body, surrounded by medical equipment. It was like staring at a blurry photograph of his past, but this time he wouldn't let his powerlessness get the better of him. The doctors explained the severity of the situation. A costly and urgent treatment was needed. The boy would require special medications and intensive care far beyond what either Robert or his ex-wife could afford. Clenching his fists in distress, he knew he had to act quickly. He would not allow himself to lose the chance to be there for his son again. The hospital, with its endless corridors and the characteristic scent of antiseptics, became the stage for this new test of will. Robert stayed at the bedside, trying to remain calm while his son slept, connected to machines monitoring his vital signs. With every beep, he remembered the letter in which his ex-wife had written about forgiveness and family, reaffirming the promise he had made to himself, never to fail again. Word of the relapse spread quickly. Anna found out when Robert called to tell her he couldn't come to the store to finish the tasks they had planned. She sprang into action at once, drafting a list of community members who could donate and phoning Isabel to mobilize the support group. Isabel, always ready to offer emotional support, gathered several members of her circle to organize a collection. Some donated money, others provided meals so that the family could remain at the hospital without worrying about dinner. Lucy, who now saw Robert as a reliable colleague at the company, spoke with Charles about the situation. Moved by the urgency, the businessman promptly offered financial resources and medical contacts that could speed up the purchase of expensive medications. Meanwhile, Diego, ever more aware of the value of human connections, arrived at Anna's store eager to help. Despite his youth, he showed unusual determination in securing any form of assistance. Thanks to this collective effort, it took only a few hours for the entire neighborhood to learn of the emergency, and many willing hands came forward to bring snacks to the hospital, share words of encouragement, or simply provide quiet companionship and comfort. Confronted by the gravity of the situation, Robert fell back on every lesson he had learned in recent months. He realized he couldn't lock himself in his pride or let despair take over. With Charles's guidance and the contacts he offered, Robert gained access to a special medical assistance program. Thanks to Father Michael's intervention and his charitable network, he found a way to cut through some of the bureaucratic red tape and obtain a costly medication that local hospitals did not stock. All the while, his ex-wife watched him in astonishment, seeing how the man who had once fled from problems and sought refuge in drink was now moving with a fierce resolve to save his son. He was no longer the same person who used to walk out with bottles in hand or who stumbled home at odd hours. Now, Robert showed a steadiness, a knack for organization, and a courage no one would have believed possible before. With the community's pooled resources and the proper medical guidance, intensive treatment for the boy began. The next few days were filled with anguish. People took turns monitoring the medical equipment and watching over the child whenever he managed to wake up. Robert barely slept, but each time exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he remembered the unconditional support of Anna, Lucy, and Charles, as well as Father Michael and Isabel's words of encouragement. "You are not alone," Isabel had told him, handing him an envelope with donations. "In this community, we've learned that when one person suffers, we all suffer." Spurred on by such solidarity, Robert, filled with gratitude, and clung even more tightly to his newly restored faith. Those conversations with Father Michael, in which they had discussed divine presence even in the worst adversities, came to life when he saw people arriving with small envelopes and heartfelt gestures of support. He realized that the hand of God could reveal itself through the compassionate acts of ordinary people. El clímax y la transformación de Robert. The doctors reported that the treatment was beginning to show encouraging results. The boy started stabilizing, and though his path to recovery would be a long one, each bit of progress brought a burst of hope. On one of the last critical nights, Robert sat at the foot of the bed and took his son's hand. "I promise I'll be here," he whispered, tears filling his eyes. "I'm going to be the father you need." When, at last, the child opened his eyes with a hint of awareness, Robert smiled in profound relief. He felt a mixture of gratitude and humility. He knew that this victory was not his alone, but that of a community that had come together more strongly than ever. At that moment, he understood that true transformation lay not in what he said, but in how he had allowed solidarity, faith, and love to guide every decision he made. That night, as he leaned against the hallway wall and watched his son through the glass of the intensive care unit, Robert became aware that life was giving him a new chance to show who he truly was. This time, bolstered by the strength he had found in the community, he wasn't going to let it slip away. 5. In the days following the hospital crisis, Robert and those around him faced crucial turning points. With the support of doctors, nurses, and the community, Robert's son began showing promising signs of improvement. Little by little, the doctors scaled back the machine assistance, and the boy regained enough strength to open his eyes and smile shyly at his father, easing everyone's pent-up anxiety. Visits to the intensive care ward grew more relaxed. With his vitals stabilizing and a more favorable prognosis, the boy was moved to a regular room, where he was met by a wave of affection, balloons, cards, and messages from people he barely knew but who had chosen to stand by Robert's family in their time of need. Among these tokens was a letter signed by Diego, wishing him a speedy recovery and inviting him to visit Anna's store once he felt better. The day the doctors discharged the child, Robert felt an indescribable surge of gratitude. Holding his son's hand, He left the hospital certain that this time he would remain by his side through thick and thin. Every step toward the exit symbolized for him the end of a painful chapter and the start of a new life full of possibilities. Right at the hospital doors, Robert and his ex-wife finally had the conversation they had put off for so long. She, exhausted but relieved, wanted to thank Robert for his tireless efforts during the crisis. Letting out a sigh, she confessed that it had surprised her to see him so involved and willing to give up everything for his son. "It's been years since I've seen you so determined," she murmured, her voice still laden with emotion. "I know you've changed, and that gives me hope." Robert lowered his gaze, remembering the letter he had found in his apartment. A lump rose in his throat as he recognized that he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Speaking from the heart, he told her about the mistakes that had driven him to isolate himself, the shame that consumed him after the divorce, and how, thanks to the help of both friends and strangers, he had decided to radically change his way of life. Both realized that although the past had left its share of scars, there was now a chance for an amicable reconciliation for their child's sake. They agreed to work together on a new family dynamic where communication came first and disagreements were settled maturely. It wasn't about rekindling their marriage, but about building a relationship of respect and affection focused on their son. Even though resentments and bitter memories remained, a seed of forgiveness began to sprout, sealing a pact that would bring greater peace to their lives. While Robert was living out his family reunion, Isabel found herself working through the challenge of helping Marta, the woman who had confessed to being involved in illegal activities, in her support group. After their first conversation in the church annex, Marta had been reluctant to take control of her situation. Still, Isabel kept at it, offering a listening ear and suggesting options for legal counseling. A sense of trust gradually grew between them. Finally, Marta agreed to meet with a volunteer lawyer who collaborated with the support group. Nervous yet resolved not to sink any deeper into crime, she explained what had driven her to make desperate decisions and voiced her willingness to set her life straight, even if that meant facing possible legal repercussions. To everyone's surprise, the lawyer found a way to negotiate so that Marta could make amends for the harm she'd done while avoiding overly harsh penalties. During the group sessions, Isabel moderated discussions with tact and empathy, reminding each participant of the importance of solidarity and faith in personal transformation. The outcome was positive. Marta got the support she needed to leave her bad influences behind and begin a comprehensive rehabilitation process. With the community's backing, she found an honest job and focused on restoring stability to her family. Seeing how the issue that had threatened the group's cohesion was resolved through the power of forgiveness and accountability, Isabel felt that her mission was bearing fruit. The dark cloud that had troubled her vanished, and her belief in the human capacity for redemption grew stronger than ever. Meanwhile, Lucy continued collaborating with Charles on restructuring the company. The audits and administrative adjustments yielded positive results. Buoyed by the improvements, she proposed a community project to involve local residents and small businesses, creating temporary jobs and providing opportunities for those who, like her, had experienced job insecurity. She arranged a meeting at Anna's store, attended by various community members, shop owners, volunteers, parents, and young people like Diego, all in search of new possibilities. Lucy presented her plan, establishing a network of cooperatives to produce and distribute basic goods, along with workshops to train unemployed individuals in useful trades. Excitement among the attendees was immediate. Anna offered her store as a collection and distribution point. Charles promised logistical resources and supplier contacts through his company. Diego, having largely distanced himself from his old gang, showed interest in coordinating a recycling and waste collection program, a socially minded idea that surprised many. Within a few weeks, the community project took off. Small urban gardens began producing fresh foods, sewing and carpentry workshops were organized, and local fairs sprang up to showcase the products. Fueled by tireless passion, Lucy became the driving force, coordinating every detail and bringing the community together with a shared goal, to grow collectively and offer stability to those who once felt abandoned. Thanks to Robert's son's recovery, his amicable reconciliation with his ex-wife, the resolution of Isabel's group conflict, and the success of Lucy's community initiative, each of these individuals found a place in a growing communal fabric that strengthened by the day. Robert, who had once felt lost in darkness, now saw the light mirrored in his son's eyes, aware that he was surrounded by the unwavering support of friends and neighbors. Anna, satisfied to see Diego finding his path, realized that her calling to serve remained intact and that Lucy's project opened up a world of possibilities for the neighborhood. Charles, for his part, transformed his company and proved that integrity could be just as profitable as any other successful venture. Isabel breathed a sigh of relief, for her support group had not only survived Marta's crisis, but also grown in understanding and unity. In this way, the power of decisions made with honesty and solidarity became evident on every corner of the community. Pain, doubt, and loneliness, which at one point had seemed insurmountable, turned into the foundation of a collective renewal. A hopeful spirit filled the air, reflected in each face with the conviction that, despite past mistakes and dark moments, the future could be built on love, cooperation, and mutual faith. 5. The church looked different that morning. A group of volunteers had arrived early to cover the pews with colorful ribbons and floral arrangements, while others set up candles and prepared a simple altar adorned with white linens. The atmosphere was festive. At the doors, several neighbors greeted anyone who wished to attend. In the aisles, you could hear laughter and cheerful hellos. It seemed unbelievable that only a few months earlier, this same place had been the scene of Robert's desperate plea. By the appointed time, the church was packed. Charles and Lucy arrived together, accompanied by several employees who had taken part in reforming the company. Lucy greeted everyone she met with a smile, aware that the community initiative she led had the support of many who were present. Charles, meanwhile, exchanged words of thanks and promised new projects for the neighborhood. Anna showed up soon after, followed closely by Diego. The young man, once aloof and rebellious, now had a calm look and a relaxed demeanor. He had cut his hair and was wearing a clean shirt that contrasted with his former disheveled appearance. Seeing them together, people remembered how Anna had taken him under her wing, enduring his stubbornness and confusion. Every step they took revealed further proof of his transformation. Isabel sat in the front rows, seizing the opportunity to place some flyers about her support group. Since she had helped Marta move away from illegal activities, she had noticed greater trust and solidarity among the participants. She felt grateful for a community that responded generously in times of crisis, just as they had done for Robert's family when his son was gravely ill. Finally, Robert arrived with his ex-wife and their son, who, after his hospital recovery, looked lively and curious about the celebratory mass. The boy gazed in wonder at the decorations, flowers, and soft music playing in the background. Meanwhile, Robert, staying close to his family, received warm greetings from many neighbors. His demeanor was visibly different. He stood taller, and his expression reflected a mixture of serenity and humility, signs of an inner rebirth. Robert's address. Once everyone had gathered, Father Michael opened the ceremony with a prayer of thanksgiving, highlighting the importance of brotherly love and unity. He took the opportunity to invite Robert to speak, believing that his story embodied the transformation he hoped to foster within the community. Robert walked up to the microphone, his heart racing. Taking a deep breath, he looked out at the expectant faces of family, friends, and acquaintances. He recalled the day he had raised his voice in this very church to challenge God in anger. Now, however, the reason for his words was entirely different. "This morning, I want to thank everyone who reached out to me when I needed it most," he began in a steady voice. "Your empathy and support have shown me that faith isn't just expressed through prayers, but through concrete acts of solidarity." He spoke about the importance of community, how even the smallest gesture could save a life or change someone's destiny. He mentioned Anna and her tireless generosity, Charles and Lucy for embracing honesty in business, Isabel for believing in the power of unity, and Father Michael for never hesitating to offer spiritual guidance. He even offered a few words to Diego, acknowledging the courage it takes to walk away from bad influences. "I've realized that everyday life is where the divine also resides," he concluded. "I've seen it in the compassion you've all shown me, my son, and everyone in need. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to be born again." Applause echoed off the church walls following his speech. From that moment on, each person's story found its own resolution. Anna and Diego. They continued their mentor-mentee relationship. Diego no longer missed school and was starting to excel in his classes. His old gang was a thing of the past. With every achievement, Anna felt her mission to help him believe in himself was being fulfilled. Charles and Lucy. Charles formally restarted his company with ethical practices and transparency in all operations. Lucy, who had become one of his trusted pillars, continued her role in the company, but also led a successful community project, generating jobs and boosting prosperity in the neighborhood. Father Michael. After moments of doubt, the priest rediscovered the encouragement he needed to reconcile with his vocation through the support network and the renewed faith of his parishioners. Each Mass reminded him that his role went beyond the pulpit. He walked alongside the people, sharing in their joys and sorrows. Isabel. Having worked through her own personal grief and helped others face their own losses, she kept running the support group with renewed energy. Each session became a space for healing and sharing stories of triumph over adversity. Robert and his family. The amicable reconciliation with his ex-wife strengthened his bond with his son, offering a future where, despite their separation, affection prevailed. With every visit, Robert felt the wound of the past healing, knowing that, thanks to his effort and the community's support, he could finally be the father he had always wanted to be. When the Mass ended, Father Michael invited everyone to join a volunteer activity at the neighborhood park. Amid laughter and animated conversation, teams formed to plant trees and tidy up the green areas, a symbolic act reflecting, in a simple way, the importance of planting new roots and caring for what had changed. Amid the lively bustle, Robert paused for a moment to take it all in. Anna and Isabel laughing with a group of children, Diego showing off his skill with a shovel, Lucy and Charles organizing the planting, and his ex-wife holding their son's hand as she showed him how to pat the earth around a tiny sapling. The sun lit up that scene of solidarity, and in that moment, Robert felt a profound sense of gratitude. He understood that faith could come in unexpected ways, sometimes in a church decorated for celebration, other times in hands joined together to cultivate shared hope. Breathing deeply and smiling, he knew he had found a renewed purpose and a restored faith in humanity, and with that, he had reconciled with God. Faith in God is like a small flame that lights up even in the densest darkness. When we feel lost or abandoned, that flame may seem weak. Yet with trust and perseverance, we realize it never truly goes out. Even in our worst moments, when despair pushes us to question God's presence, He remains by our side, giving us opportunities to move forward and surrounding us with people who, often unknowingly, become instruments of His love. Refusing to doubt Him means recognizing that behind every trial lies a purpose guiding us toward inner growth. By standing firm in this belief, we learn that faith isn't a reward granted only to those whose lives run smoothly, but a constant refuge for those caught in life's storms, reminding us that in the end, God's light always rises again. This story shows the power a community can wield when its members unite to share their help and talents. From someone offering a simple cup of coffee to another who marshals significant resources to aid someone in trouble, each act of solidarity can change lives. It also teaches us that true change doesn't come from instant miracles, but from each person's willingness to face their wounds, own their responsibilities, and embrace redemption. It shows as well that no one is condemned to remain in the past. Empathy, honesty, and service to others can generate second chances. Ultimately, the story reminds us that faith, whether in God, in humanity, or in oneself, is the pillar supporting the hope of a better future, for when we believe and act accordingly, we're capable of deep, lasting transformation. Thank you so much for reading this far. I hope you found something valuable in this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. Your presence means a lot to me. Take care, and I'll see you soon in the next video. Goodbye for now.